The winter ball at Ashworth Park began, as all such occasions did, with light that cost more than most families earned in a year. 40 candles burned in the chandelier above the entrance hall. 40 more in each arm of the grand staircase. The glow reached even to the outer passage where servants moved in parallel procession, carrying trays and salvers and the detritus of 300 guests who would consume in a single evening what kept the household staff clothed for a season. It was the 3rd week of December, and the frost outside had hardened to something that cracked underfoot, and inside this warmth was another kind of cruelty. Dressed as generosity, Nell Hartley stood at the far end of the corridor with a tray of used crystal in her hands, and her breath still visible in the air, because the servants' passage had no fire, and the stone wall behind her had been drawing cold since October. She wore a gray dress that had belonged to the previous head housemaid, let out at the hem and taken in at the shoulders, and still not quite right in either direction. The fabric had thinned at the elbows to something that was nearly transparent. Her hands, bare, had gone from red to white at the knuckles in the 20 minutes since she had last been near the kitchen fire. She was not supposed to be visible. That was the instruction Mrs. Croft had given her that morning, and the morning before, and the week before that, in the 3 months since Nell had arrived at Ashworth Park to take up her position. Do not appear in the main rooms. Do not approach the guests. Do not be seen by Lord Ashworth or any of his household, unless you are summoned for a task that requires it. She was a maid. She was to be invisible like the walls. And yet here was the thing about the corridor that connected the servants' passage to the east drawing room, which had 2 doors, and the one on the left had swung open at 10 minutes past 9 because a guest had been searching for a retiring room and had not found it. And the doorway now stood wide enough for a man standing in the drawing room to see precisely what stood in the passage if he happened to look. Lord Edmund Ashworth happened to look. She knew the moment it occurred because the quality of the noise from the drawing room altered. Not loudly, not obviously. Just a particular variety of silence that forms when something unexpected crosses the line of a man who held authority over everything in it. Nell did not move. The tray was heavy. Her arms had already begun to ache somewhere above the elbow, and setting the crystal down in this passage would mean setting it on stone. And Mrs. Croft had very clear opinions about crystal on stone. She stood. She watched the open door without appearing to watch it. Lord Ashworth was 34 years old and had been master of Ashworth Park for 6 years since the death of his father in the spring of 1811. He was tall in the way of men who have not spent years attempting to diminish themselves, and he wore black tonight with a single concession to celebration in the white cravat pinned with something that caught the candlelight once and did not catch it again. He had dark hair and a face that the county had spent years describing as cold. Nell had been at Ashworth Park for 3 months and had formed the private opinion that they were wrong. It was not cold. It was controlled. There was a difference, and the difference was in the eyes which tracked and calculated and registered without ever performing any of those functions for the benefit of an observer. He registered her now. He did not speak immediately. A woman at his left shoulder was saying something about the arrangements, the flowers on the mantel, the quality of the chandelier work. He appeared to listen. He did not look away from Nell. And then the open door closed, because a footman pushed it shut from the drawing-room side. And the corridor was merely a corridor again, and Nell carried her tray to the kitchen and set it down on the table, and stood for a moment with her hands against the warmth of the range until feeling returned to her fingers. She was, to the household at Ashworth Park, just a maid and nothing more. That was how Lady Ashworth had described her at dinner 2 days after Nell's arrival, in the particular tone one uses for persons who occupy the category of necessary furniture. Just a maid, Lady Ashworth had said to Mrs. Matter. Croft, as though establishing a position on a ledger sheet. Nothing more. Nell had been at the sideboard at the time, her back correctly turned, and she had registered the description with the specific quality of attention she had learned to give to things she was not permitted to refuse. The dowager had been the former mistress of this house, Edmund's mother, who had remained in residence at the park following her husband's death, because Edmund had not asked her to leave and she had shown no inclination to go. She was 61, precise in her movements, and had the kind of beauty that had never required effort, because the structure of her face was argument enough. She wore her displeasure as other women wore jewelry, deliberately chosen, carefully positioned, designed to be noticed. She had noticed Nell on the second day and had drawn her conclusion by the third. Just a maid, nothing more. The ball continued. Nell moved through it the way water moves through a mill race, channeled, directed, never resting in any place long enough to leave an impression. She refilled the wine ewers in the east drawing room. She collected the used plates from the supper table in the side hall. She retrieved a dropped shawl from the second landing and returned it to a lady whose name she did not know, and the lady took it without looking at her face. It was during the second return to the kitchen just before 11 o'clock that the accident occurred. She had not seen the rug corner lifting from the flagstone in the servants' passage, because the candle at that end of the corridor had burned down to nothing, and no one had yet replaced it. She caught her foot on it, and she did not fall. Her body corrected. The tray corrected. Not a single piece of crystal moved. The motion had carried her sideways into the wall, and her left elbow connected with the stone, and the sound she made was very small and quite involuntary. She stood for a moment with her forehead against the cold wall, and her elbow pressed against her ribs, and her eyes closed, Miss Hartley. The voice came from behind her. She turned, because there was nothing else to be done. Lord Ashworth stood in the passage. He had come through the door at the east end and closed it behind him, and the quality of the silence around him was the same. It had been through the drawing-room doorway, attentive and contained. He was looking at her with an expression that had not changed from the one she had seen through the open door. And it did not change now. "The rug," he said. "Mrs. Croft should have seen to it." "I am perfectly well, my lord," she said, which was partly true. He looked at her hands, which had gone white again from the cold. He looked at the dress, the thin elbows, the hem that was not quite right. Something in the line of his jaw, altered by a fraction that would have been invisible to anyone who had not learned in the past 3 months to read the smallest available signals. "How long have you been in this passage tonight?" he said. "Since 8 o'clock, my lord. In that dress," he said. It was not a question. She did not answer it as one. "It is the uniform, my lord." There was a pause. Through the wall, she could hear the orchestra beginning the third set, the sound of it muffled to something almost pleasant by the stone between here and there. He removed his coat. The action was so quiet and so deliberate that she did not immediately understand what she was watching. He was simply a man removing his coat with the same economy he would bring to any motion, folding it once and then settling it across her shoulders before she had formed a coherent response to any of this. The warmth was immediate and very nearly overwhelming. The coat was superfine wool, dark, and it retained the heat of his body as though it had been designed for precisely this purpose, which it had not. She felt her shoulders drop an inch that she had not known they had been holding. "My lord," she said. "I cannot." "You are shaking," he said. "You have been shaking since the corridor." She had not known that. "Mrs. Croft will see," she said. "Mrs. Croft is serving the supper table," he said. "Walk with me to the kitchen." He carried the tray. She followed, wearing his coat, which came to her knees and smelled of cedar and cold air, and something she could not name that she would spend considerable time afterward trying not to think about. If you have ever watched a man who has not yet understood his own intentions, you know the quality of attention he gives to small things. He asked her, in the kitchen passage, how long she had held her previous position. She told him. He asked why she had left it. She told him that as well. Her employer had died, and the family had come to settle the estate, and there had been no place for the household staff in the arrangement that followed. He said nothing to this. He set the tray on the scullery table with the same care he would have given a document of significance. She tried to return the coat. He declined, with a single word, and left by the back passage. She did not see him again that evening. She was folding the coat very precisely in the small room she shared with the upper housemaid. Mira. Later that night, when Mira woke up and looked at the coat, and then at Nell, and then at the coat again, with an expression of comprehensive understanding. "Say nothing," Nell told her. "I have not said a word," Mira said, and went back to sleep. She said something at breakfast. She said it quietly, to Nell only. And what she said was that Lord Ashworth had been known, before his father's death, as a man who attended to things others overlooked. His father had been the kind of man who allowed a great deal to be overlooked in the name of order. Edmund had spent the 6 years since attempting to correct what could be corrected. He lost someone, Mira said, meaning his wife, and then said no more about it, because the bell rang and the kitchen re-engaged itself with the morning. He returned the coat formally the following week. He sent it down by the footman with a note that said simply, "Return this to Mrs. Croft's inventory," which meant return it to the household stores, which was either a very careful arrangement of plausible distance or was precisely what it appeared to be. A man returning an item to its correct position. She thought about it rather too much. The note had been for Mrs. Croft. The coat had come to Nell. She was not certain what to do with the arithmetic of these facts, and elected, eventually, to do nothing at all. December continued. The household prepared for Christmas in the systematic way of large establishments, with greenery cut and arranged, windows cleaned a second time against the frost, correspondence managed, and fires built up, and the inevitable series of small crises that accompany any occasion, managed one at a time by the staff whose name none of the guests would ever know. Nell managed the rooms on the east corridor, which included the small library that sat between the morning room and the study. She learned this about him in the library. He arrived at 6 in the morning when the house was still quiet, and stood at the window with a cup of tea and read whatever came to hand. He did not make noise. He did not require attendance. He had a way of occupying a room that left it less disturbed than he found it, which was unusual in men of his position in Nell's experience. He noticed when she arrived to lay the fire, and gave no indication that he was bothered by the intrusion. But he stepped to the far side of the room, to give her space without appearing to give her space, which required a kind of peripheral attention she was beginning to understand was habitual. She watched him from the corner of her eye, not watching her. There was a portrait above the library mantel, a young woman in a white gown, painted sometime in the previous decade. The painting was good and the face was specific, not genericized by flattery. A woman who had been 30 perhaps, with pale hair and an expression of contained intelligence. Nell had been in the library for 3 weeks before she understood that he almost never looked at it directly, the way one avoids looking at something that costs too much to look at fully. She mentioned none of this to Mira. She mentioned none of it to anyone. On the 20th of December, which was a Tuesday, the Dowager held a small dinner for 8 guests. Nell was assigned to the side table because Mrs. Croft had taken ill, and the first housemaid had been reassigned to cover the upper hall, and there was no one else available with enough knowledge of the silver. She saw Nell when the soup was cleared and said nothing until the fish course, at which point she turned to the woman at her right, who was the wife of a neighboring magistrate, and said, in the carrying voice she used for things she meant to be heard, "I could not get decent help for this dinner. My son will insist on keeping every stray that wanders to the door." A maid who was dismissed from her previous post, and now here she is among the silver. The table registered this. It registered it the way tables always did, with a momentary pause in the normal current of conversation, a slight adjustment in the attention of those nearest, a quality of listening that pretended not to be listening. Nell did not move. She had the serving fork in her hand, and she kept it there, and kept her expression exactly where it was. Lord Ashworth, at the head of the table, set down his wine-glass. He did not speak immediately. The pause lasted exactly long enough for the room to become certain he was going to speak. "Miss Hartley was not dismissed," he said. His voice was the same level it always was, and the level carried the distance to every part of the table without effort. Her employer died. The estate did not retain the household staff. These are separate matters. The dowager's fan, which she had been holding open, closed by a quarter. "Of course," she said, in the tone of a woman adjusting for the public record. The dinner continued. Nell served the remove, and the next course, and the one after that, and no further remark was made, and the magistrate's wife spoke rather too enthusiastically about the table arrangements, and by the time the ladies withdrew, the incident had been thoroughly buried under the normal pleasantries of an English December dinner. But Nell carried it the length of the hall and into the passage, with her, the specific warmth of it, the particular sensation of being accounted for by a voice that carried to the end of the table. She had not asked for it. She had not expected it. She set down the last of the service pieces and stood in the passage for a moment with her eyes on the wall. She thought he should not have done that. She thought she was grateful that he did. She thought with the precision she usually reserved for things she would not permit herself to do anything about, that this was a problem. The holidays brought house guests. 6 of them, arriving across 3 days, in carriages that had to be managed, and luggage that had to be brought up, and rooms that had to be prepared in a state of perpetual readiness. Nell worked the days in full and parts of the nights when the fires needed banking in the guest rooms, and slept in pieces between shifts, and was therefore not at her most collected on the morning of Christmas Eve, when she came around the corner of the upstairs gallery and found Lord Ashworth there, standing in front of the portrait of his daughter. She had not known until that moment that the child in the nursery, the small girl with pale hair who had come down to the drawing-room twice in Nell's tenure and sat in the window seat with a book without saying a word to anyone, was his. He had a manner with the child that was careful in the way of men who are afraid of being mistaken about what they feel, which was to say he did not pick her up or speak to her with the warmth she suspected he carried. But he positioned himself in rooms she occupied and answered her questions with a specific attentiveness that most adults did not bother to give to children. He was looking at the portrait in the gallery, which was of his wife, which matched the painting in the library in nothing, except the face. She stopped. He heard her stop. He did not turn, but the quality of his posture shifted very slightly, the way a man's does when he has decided to permit himself to be observed. "She has been gone 4 years," he said. He was not speaking to Nell exactly. He was speaking in the way of a man who has been alone with a thought long enough that it finds its own voice. "My daughter does not remember her." Nell stood where she was. She understood from the arrangement of the silence that she was not required to respond and that a response would not be unwelcome. "That must be a particular grief," she said, "to hold the memory for them both." He turned. He looked at her the way he had looked at her through the drawing-room door, the way he had looked at her in the passage steadily with the expression that was not cold, that was in fact the opposite of cold, that had been calibrated so long to appear as distance that she was only now, at this proximity, beginning to understand it for what it was. "Yes," he said, "that is precisely it." They stood there a moment in the gallery with the portrait between them and the sound of the household below managing Christmas, and then he stepped aside to let her pass, and she passed, and the gallery returned to its ordinary proportions. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the narrow bed and thought about his face in the gallery, and the coat across her shoulders in the passage, and the sound of his voice at the dinner table, level and carrying and unambiguous. And she thought about the child in the nursery with her mother's pale hair, and she thought, "I am a maid in this house. I have 6 months left on my agreement. After that, I will go somewhere else and manage that situation when it comes." This was the sensible thought, and she held it firmly until it stopped being quite as firm as she had intended. On Christmas morning, Lord Ashworth sent down a parcel to the staff hall. It contained, among other things for the other servants, a pair of woolen gloves for each of the housemaids in the correct sizes, which meant someone had noticed what sizes their hands were. Mrs. Britz. Croft opened the parcels with her usual expression of having expected nothing and finding nothing surprising about being given something. The gloves were well made and dark-colored and practical. Nell put hers on and stood at the kitchen fire for a moment with her hands pressed together, warm for the first time in 3 months. Mira watched her. "I have still said nothing," Mira said. "Good," Nell said. She meant it. She continued to mean it for 10 more days, while the houseguests departed, and January arrived, and the pace of the house returned to its winter rhythm. She meant it through the morning in the library, when she came to lay the fire and found him already there, reading. And he looked up and said, "Good morning, Miss Hartley," with an inflection on the second word that she was not certain she had heard correctly. She meant it while she was stripping the bed linens in the east guest rooms and could hear him walking the corridor below, the particular cadence of his step that she had learned without meaning to learn. She meant it until the afternoon in the 3rd week of January, when she went into the small sitting room off the morning room to retrieve a candlestick she had left there and found that the sitting room was occupied. The dowager sat in the armchair by the window. With her was a woman. Nell did not know, perhaps 50, with the particular bearing of someone accustomed to receiving rather than giving attention. They were deep in conversation. They did not stop when Nell entered, because Nell was not the kind of person one stopped conversation for. The difficulty, she was saying, is that he has allowed himself to become peculiar about the staff, a maid who is nothing more than a charity case from a failed household. And he corrects me at my own dinner table about her. The other woman made a sound of sympathetic concern. "I have written to his cousin Frederica's mother," the dowager said. "Frederica would be here by Easter, if Edmund would apply himself. She is everything one could want. Good family, good sense, and she would not permit this sentimental nonsense to continue. A proper mistress of this house would have the staff properly managed, and there would be no question of charity maids and winter coats." Nell took the candlestick. She took it quietly, and she left the room the way she had entered, and she walked back to the east wing, and she stood in the passage for a moment and breathed carefully. She had known this. This was not news. She had understood from the day she arrived that she was temporary and replaceable, and that the house had its own arrangements and plans, and the plans did not include her. She had understood this in December when he put his coat on her shoulders. She had understood it in the gallery at Christmas. She had understood it every morning in the library, which was why she had said nothing and done nothing, and continued to mean to say and do nothing. She went back to her work. She was very good at going back to her work. The invitation to Frederica arrived in visible form on the 29th of January, because the dowager had, in her management of the household that she had never quite relinquished, a habit of announcing certain decisions as accomplished facts. She told Mrs. Croft at breakfast that Miss Frederica Vane would be staying at Ashworth Park from the 3rd of February for a fortnight, as a guest of her personal arrangement, and that the rose suite was to be prepared. Croft relayed this to the household. Nell prepared the rose suite. Frederica Vane arrived on a Thursday with 2 trunks and a maid of her own, and the specific variety of beauty that has been cultivated like a hothouse plant, entirely dependent on the conditions that produced it, and not quite comprehending of weather outside those conditions. She was 23, and had excellent manners, and a laugh that was precisely calibrated to the drawing room. She did not look at Nell when Nell took her coat in the entrance hall. The dowager, standing at the bottom of the staircase, looked at Nell instead, and the look said what the words at the dinner table had said, and what she said to Mrs. Croft in the morning room later that day confirmed the rest of it. "That maid, the gray one. Keep her out of the main rooms while Miss Vane is here." The gray one. That was new. Mira told her that evening, apologetically, with the expression of a woman who does not enjoy delivering information but understands that not delivering it is worse. She said it as though you were a piece of furniture she did not want moved. Mira said the gray one, "I have been called worse." Nell said which was true. "You should not have been called that at all," Mira said, which was also true but less useful. Nell stayed out of the main rooms. She managed the east wing, the staff passage, the back stairs. She folded linen and carried coal and did not appear in any space that Miss Vane occupied. She was very nearly entirely successful at this for 11 days, which brought her to the 14th of February, which was a Sunday. It was cold. It had been cold for a week, the kind of cold that seeps rather than strikes, that finds the places where the stone is thin or the mortar worn and takes up residence. The east wing passage had a window that did not fully close, and the wind that came through it had stripped the corridor of any warmth the house had managed to accumulate. Nell had wedged a piece of folded cloth into the gap 3 times, and had been removed each time by forces she could not identify. She was carrying coal to the East Library, which was the small room off the main library that Lord Ashworth used for correspondence, because the fire in the East Library had gone down during the service hour when no one had been permitted to attend it, and the room was now cold enough to see breath. She came around the corner from the back stairs and stopped. Lord Ashworth was in the East Library passage. He was not alone. Miss Vane stood a little apart from him at the exact distance that propriety required, and the Dowager stood slightly behind them both at the distance that management required. They appeared to have come from the main library. The conversation had the quality of a conversation that had been in progress for some time. Nell retreated 1 step. She did not retreat quite far enough. The Dowager saw her. The look was immediate and comprehensive, and it contained everything the dinner table had contained, and everything the morning room had contained. And what she said, in a voice pitched carefully to reach the right ears without appearing to be raised, was this: "The Grey Maid. She was instructed to stay out of these rooms." Miss Vane turned and looked at Nell with a polite expression that did not know quite what to do with what it saw. Lord Ashworth turned and looked at Nell with his usual expression, which was still inattentive, and which she had learned to read but did not know, until this moment, whether she had been reading correctly. She spoke to Miss Vane in the tone of a woman explaining a household eccentricity to a guest whose opinion of the household she values. "My son has a habit of charitable impulse where the staff is concerned. One cannot fault kindness, but it does produce a certain confusion about stations. This particular maid was given a coat in December that was quite above her position, and has had some difficulty understanding her proper place since." The sentence landed in the passage like the draft from the window, cold and comprehensive. Nell stood very still. The coal scuttle was heavy. Her hands were bare because she had left the gloves in the staff hall. The gray dress was thin at the elbows. Lord Ashworth did not immediately speak, and in the silence she heard his mother's confidence harden by a degree, the particular reinforcement of certainty that silence provides. To a woman who has spent 60 years having her certainties reinforced. Then he moved. He crossed to the coal scuttle and took it from her hands, which was not a thing she had expected, and which left her with nothing to hold. And then he removed his coat for the second time in 3 months and placed it across her shoulders. It was not a dramatic gesture. There was nothing performative about it. He did it as a man does a thing he has been intending to do for some time and has decided to stop finding reasons to defer. He turned to his mother. "Miss Hartley," he said, "is not a charity case. She is a woman of sense and capability who came to this house through circumstance, rather than failing, and she has been performing 2 servants' work in an east wing that has been inadequately heated since October, because I did not attend to the maintenance schedule as I should have done. If there is a confusion of stations here, it belongs to the household's management, not to her." The Dowager's fan was in her hand. It did not close. It remained open, but she held it, with a degree of force that was visible in the line of her wrist. Miss Vane said nothing. She was a young woman who had been told her entire life what the correct choice was, and for the first time the room was not telling her. "Mother," Lord Ashworth said, "Miss Vane is your guest. Please see to her comfort." He paused, for the fraction that let the meaning settle. "I will speak with you this evening." She withdrew. She did it with the composure of a woman who knows that the field has shifted and is choosing her moment rather than her ground. And this was a different variety of retreat from the kind that comes from defeat. But it was a retreat, and the corridor registered it as one. Miss Vane followed, with a brief, precise look at Nell that contained no malice and a good deal of recalculation. Nell stood in the East Library passage, wearing Lord Ashworth's coat for the second time in 3 months. And this time she did not tell him she could not. He picked up the coal scuttle and carried it into the East Library, and built the fire himself, which was another thing she had not anticipated, and did it with the competence of a man who had done it before, and had no particular feeling about whether anyone observed him doing it. When the fire was established, he stood and dusted his hands. "Nell," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. It was the first time she had heard it from him, and it landed in the room with the specific weight of things, said once and not retracted. She looked at him. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. "I have been attending to the wrong things." She understood, with the particular precision she brought to things she could not quite let herself believe yet, that he was not speaking only about the East Wing maintenance schedule. "My lord," she said. "Edmund," he said, which was either a correction or an invitation, and she was going to have to decide which she intended it to be. She considered this. The fire was warm behind her and the coat was warm across her shoulders, and the corridor outside had gone quiet again. The household settled back into its February rhythms, and she thought about what it meant to be seen by someone whose seeing mattered, and about what it meant to have heard her own name said in a voice that had not diminished it. "That will take some managing," she said. Something shifted in the line of his face that she had seen only once before, in the gallery at Christmas, and only then because she had been paying very close attention. "Yes," he said. "It will." He did not that afternoon say anything more declarative than that. He was a man who had been careful for a long time, and who had learned that careful men do not unsay things, and so he said only what he meant, and no more than he meant. He sat in the East Library for 2 hours that evening, and she was present for the first of them. And the fire was warm, and he asked her about the position she had held before this one. And she told him, and he listened in the way of a man who is learning something, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He spoke to his mother that evening, as he had said he would. Nell did not hear the conversation. She heard its edges from the staff passage below the morning room where she was carrying a lamp back to the kitchen, catching the particular rhythm of two voices engaged in the kind of exchange that has been building for longer than its immediate occasion suggests. His mother's voice, controlled, and then less controlled, his voice consistent throughout. The following morning, the dowager came to the breakfast table, in the manner of a woman who has, in the night, recalibrated her understanding of the available ground. She said nothing about Nell. She spoke to Mrs. Croft about the February accounts and to Miss Vane about the visit to the village church, and she did these things with the composure of a woman who is choosing, very deliberately, what to do next. Miss Vane departed on the 16th of February 2 days early, with a note to Edmund's mother that expressed gratitude for the hospitality, and a regret that prior engagements required her to return to town. Nell folded the rose sweet linens and thought this was perhaps for the best, for everyone. The month of February continued. The east wing window was repaired, finally by the carpenter who had been meant to attend to it in November. The fire in the East Library was maintained without fail. Lord Ashworth continued to arrive at 6 in the morning to stand at the library window with his tea, and Nell continued to arrive at 6 1/4 to lay the fire in the East Library, and on the mornings when she finished early, she sometimes paused at the main library door long enough for him to hear her pause. He began, in these pauses, to say things, not significant things. Initially, the temperature. A passage in whatever he was reading, offered without explanation, as though she might already know the book. A question about the household, specific and practical, that no one else had thought to ask her. She answered, and he listened, and she began to understand that this was what he looked like when he was not managing his face for the benefit of an audience. He looked when unmanaged, like a man who had been careful for so long that he had nearly forgotten what ease felt like, and was now remembering it in pieces. His daughter came down from the nursery in the second week of March and found them in the library, Nell at the fire and Lord Ashworth at the window, and looked between them with the specific acuity of small children who have been paying attention to adults longer than the adults know. "You are both here," Clara said, which was a statement of the obvious, delivered as an observation. "Yes," Lord Ashworth said. Clara came and stood next to Nell at the fire for a while, which required no explanation from either of them. By April, it had settled into something that they had not named and did not need to name yet, because the naming would require a series of conversations that had their own sequence and could not be rushed. Nell had begun to understand that he was working toward it the way he worked toward most things, methodically, without announcing his progress, attending to each part in order. He asked her to walk with him on the grounds on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of April, when the weather had turned and the gardens were beginning to recover from the winter. He asked her formally in front of Mrs. Tonger. Croft, with the precision of a man who understands that the form of an action is part of its content. She understood what he was doing. She accepted formally, which meant she understood. They walked the south garden path and then the east grounds at the proper distance, while the household presumably observed this from various windows and drew the conclusions it was meant to draw. He told her in the east garden about his wife. Not everything, only the shape of it. They had married young, and it had been a good marriage, and she had died of fever in the second year of the war, the winter of 1812, and left him the portrait and the child, and 4 years of learning what it meant to manage a grief that had nowhere useful to go. "Clara does not remember her," he said. "No," Nell said. "You told me." He looked at her. "In the gallery." Yes, he was quiet for a moment. They had stopped at the end of the east path where the stone wall met the garden gate, and the afternoon light came over the wall, at an angle that softened everything it touched. He was not wearing a coat. He had not thought to bring one, and the April air was only just warm enough to be honest about it. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what it would mean to ask you something." "I expect," she said carefully, "that it would mean I would have to answer it." The edge of something almost like amusement crossed his face. "Yes," he said, "that is precisely the difficulty." He did not ask it that afternoon. He walked her back to the house and thanked her for the company with the formality that had become, between them, a kind of private language, and went in by the front, and she went in by the side, which was still the arrangement, and she stood in the staff passage with her hand against the stone wall for a moment. Warm from the walk, and from something she had stopped pretending was not there. He asked it in the library. He asked it on a Thursday morning in the last week of April, while she was finishing the fire. And he was standing at the window, and it was not preceded by any particular announcement. He simply turned from the window and said her name. And she stood, and he said quietly, "I mean to speak to the solicitor next week about a matter that requires, first, your answer. If the answer is no, I will not raise it again, and it will not affect your position here. If the answer is yes, we will need to do this properly, which will require time and the involvement of certain parties whose involvement I can manage." She stood with the fire iron in her hand and looked at him. "I would like," he said, "to marry you, Nell." 12 words. She counted them afterward, standing in the staff hall with the fire iron still in her hand, and Mira looking at her with an expression of having always known. She had said yes. She had said it very quietly, in the library, with the fire warm behind her and the morning light coming through the window over his shoulder, and he had not immediately done anything that could not be managed, only nodded once, as though something had been confirmed that he had already arranged his understanding around. The solicitor came the following week. His mother was informed on the Wednesday evening, which was a conversation Nell was not present for, but whose aftermath she witnessed the next morning. The dowager sat at the breakfast table with the expression of a woman reviewing a map she had assumed was settled, and finding that the terrain has changed while she was looking at it from the wrong direction. She came to find Nell in the afternoon. She came to the east wing, which meant she had asked Mrs. Croft, and she entered the small sitting room where Nell was managing the linen inventory. And she stood in the doorway for a moment, with the composure of 60 years' practice. "Well," she said. "My lady," Nell said, another pause. The dowager's eyes moved over the room, over Nell, over the linen, over the window with its repaired frame. "He is not," she said, "a man who does things lightly." "No," Nell said. "I have observed that." "Aye," she said, and then stopped, which was unusual for a woman who did not often stop mid-sentence and then began again. "I was not kind to you." The room held this observation without comment. "I was not unkind for the reasons I gave," the Dowager said, with the precision of a woman choosing honesty because the alternative has been removed. "I was unkind because he looked at you in December, at that ball through an open door, and I saw it before he did." Nell was quiet. "He does not look at most people," she said. "He has not looked at anyone in 4 years." She did not wait for a response to this. She turned and left the sitting room, and her footsteps went down the east wing passage and then up the main stair, and the house returned to its usual sounds. Nell sat with the linen inventory in her hands and thought about December and a doorway, and the particular quality of attention she had dismissed for months as a man of rank noticing a problem in his household management. She had been wrong about what he was noticing. She had not been wrong about his intentions, only about the direction of them. They were married in the church at the edge of the estate grounds on a Wednesday in July, which was a small ceremony by the standards of the county, which was to say there were 30 guests and a proper breakfast afterward in the rose garden. Clara sat in the front pew with her nurse and held her hands very correctly in her lap until the end of the service, at which point she said, to no one in particular, "You are both here." Mira attended as Nell's particular guest. His mother attended in black, which was either a comment or a matter of habit, and afterward said to the wife of the nearest magistrate that it was a very sensible arrangement which was, from her, a variety of approval that everyone present understood and no one chose to correct. The house, by autumn, had adjusted in the way of houses that are managed by people who attend to them. The east wing window stayed repaired. The staff had proper winter uniforms ordered in August, and the coal distribution had been recalculated by the housekeeper under new instructions. Clara came down from the nursery more often. She sat in the library in the mornings and read, in the deliberate and slightly laborious way of children learning what reading is for. She asked Nell, one morning in October, about the portrait in the library. "That is your mother," Nell said. "I know," Clara said. "Papa told me." She considered the painting for a moment. She looked like she was thinking about something. "Yes," Nell said. "She does." Clara went back to her book. Outside the library window, the grounds had turned to the deep gold of an English October, the kind of light that makes stone buildings look warm even when the air has already gone cold. The fire was lit, and had been for an hour. Lord Ashworth arrived at the library door at 10:30, later than his usual 6, because he had been down to the estate office since dawn attending to the autumn accounts, and he looked first at Clara and then at Nell with the expression she had learned to read correctly the first time, now the one that was not cold, that had never been cold. He crossed the room without particular announcement and stood beside her at the fire for a moment. And in the manner they had settled into, he did not need to say what he meant. She was warm. The house was repaired. His daughter was in the window seat with a book, in the same room as the portrait, asking good questions. "The accounts," he said. "Are they very bad?" she said. "No," he said. "They are considerably better than last year." He stayed at the fire. The library held the three of them in the morning light, quiet and steady and warm, and the portrait above the mantel looked the way it had always looked, like a woman who was thinking about something. And if that something was this, the warmth and the child and the November coming and the long winter ahead of them all, that seemed to Nell, standing in the light with her husband beside her and the fire at her back, to be a perfectly reasonable thing to think about. If Nell's story moved you today, leave a thought in the comments. She earned every moment of this. The gloves he had given her at Christmas sat folded in the top drawer of the small writing desk she now used in the morning room. She had kept them through the spring and the summer and into the autumn, because she had meant to since December. And now the drawer was hers, and so she did.